For years, the world focused its attention on Saddam Hussein, the dictator who defied the West, invaded neighboring countries, and crushed his own people. But inside the palace, far from the international cameras, someone even crueler, more unpredictable, and more feared by the Iraqis themselves moved: his eldest son, Uday Hussein. He did not only inherit power, he also received total freedom to act as he wished. His violence was not directed at armies or political adversaries, but at common individuals, without protection or escape. According to Latif Yahia, the man forced to live as his official double, the real hell was not in the corridors of power, but behind closed doors where Uday chose his victims. There, logic disappeared, and a perverse game began where only he dictated the rules. To this he dedicated his life, to crushing the most vulnerable. Women, young people, students, wives of officers, all could become targets without prior notice. But what was the most inhumane thing Uday Hussein ever did? From the beginning, the Iraqi regime revolved around the figure of Saddam Hussein, a man who ensured the consolidation of power in all aspects of national life, and within that circle of absolute authority was his eldest son, Uday, who grew up surrounded by privileges that distanced him from any social or moral limit. Raised in a family where violence was the norm and fear a daily instrument, Uday learned from a very young age that he could dispose of everything as he pleased, and that no one would dare to stop him, because his surname was enough to guarantee him absolute impunity. His childhood was not marked by games or studies like that of other children, but by a constant exposure to his father's brutality, who organized public executions to terrorize the population, and far from rejecting those scenes, the boy accepted them as a demonstration of strength that fascinated and molded him. While other children were frightened by exemplary punishments ordered by Saddam, he observed them with enthusiasm, understanding that the ability to decide over life and death was true power, and in that environment his character was formed until he became an unbalanced personality, incapable of recognizing human value in others. From adolescence, he began to show traits of violence that could no longer be considered simple acts of rebellion, as each incident ended with the disappearance or death of people who dared to contradict him. A case that was etched in the memory of those who knew him occurred during his school years, when he took a young woman to his school as a sign of defiance against the rules. When reprimanded by a teacher, that man simply ceased to exist shortly after, which reinforced in Uday the idea that he was above the rules and that no one would dare to punish him. Impunity became part of his identity, and each act of violence was another step in his transformation into a figure feared by all. As he grew, privileges multiplied. Uday had access to unimaginable luxuries for most of the Iraqi population, from imported cars to mansions full of servants, and all of this reinforced his perception of being untouchable. From his youth, he began to frequent private parties organized in regime palaces, where alcohol and ostentation set the pace of the nights. There, he began to focus his attention on women as objects of desire who could be taken without their consent, and soon developed a pattern of forced capture and subjugation that would be repeated for years. For years, Uday perfected a system that allowed him to dispose of women without obstacles, thanks to the unconditional support of his military and political entourage. These practices did not arise overnight, but were the result of a distorted education and a context in which violence was celebrated as a display of power. The family environment also offered no containment. His mother, Sajida Talfa, Saddam's cousin and wife, constantly protected her eldest son from the consequences of his actions, interceding when her husband showed anger over the young man's excesses, and this unconditional defense contributed to Uday feeling free to do as he pleased. Thus, the regime's power structure not only opened doors to positions of authority for him, but also provided him with political and social cover, so that his crimes would remain silenced. State officials, military personnel, and bureaucrats knew what was happening, but fear of retaliation made any denunciation impossible. In this way, every time a family tried to claim for the disappearance of a daughter, they ended up being threatened or punished, which strengthened the culture of silence that allowed the horror to spread unchecked. In parallel, Uday assumed visible positions within the regime, presenting himself as a young figure who represented the continuity of family power. He was appointed head of the Iraqi Olympic Committee and the Football Federation, positions he used to impose a regime of terror on athletes, many of whom were beaten, imprisoned, or even killed for not meeting his athletic expectations. Although that brutal facet is widely remembered, behind the walls of his palaces an even more macabre scenario unfolded: the systematic use of women as victims of an apparatus of personal subjugation. Those facilities, which were supposed to symbolize modernity and prestige, became centers where structural abuse reigned, and in them Uday exercised absolute control over the life of every woman who was taken there. Subsequent testimonies collected by former collaborators and judicial documents agree that his way of acting became predictable for those around him, although no one dared to intervene. Once within his domains, the victim had no escape. Many times they were sedated or threatened with retaliation against their loved ones, and if they resisted, the consequences could be fatal. Some survivors narrated that after being violated, they were thrown into the street in degrading conditions, while others were never seen again. It is estimated that dozens and even hundreds of women disappeared in those years, although the exact number is impossible to establish due to the regime's secrecy and the destruction of evidence after the foreign invasion that ended Saddam's government. What is clear is that Uday's pattern of behavior was not an isolated secret, but a known practice within power circles, tolerated out of fear and convenience. The account of Latif Yahia, the man forced to be Uday's double, provides details that confirm this dynamic. According to his memoirs, he accompanied Uday to hotels in Baghdad where he selected women in plain sight, ordering them to be taken to his car under threat of death. On many occasions, Yahia witnessed how the dictator's son surrounded himself with young women during endless parties laden with alcohol, and how those gatherings ended in scenes of ruthless abuse that no one dared to question. The narration clearly describes how orgies combined with episodes of extreme cruelty, and how victims were treated as mere disposable objects. These types of episodes were not exceptional, but part of a daily routine where human degradation became the center of Uday's amusement. Uday's power was not limited to his private residences. The Republican Guard and intelligence services collaborated with his orders, ensuring that no woman could escape his control. Drivers, doctors, and officials were part of a network of complicity that ensured victims were captured, hidden, and erased without leaving traces. Doctors were forced to cover up physical consequences derived from these abuses, and in some cases were responsible for intervening to eliminate any future evidence. Everything was designed so that Uday's actions would remain outside any official record, and those who tried to resist were severely punished. This institutionalized machinery turned women into the main victims of a system that operated according to the whims of an unscrupulous individual. Unlike other authoritarian leaders who hid their crimes, he did it with total brazenness, supported by helpers who knew perfectly well what their role was: to search, identify, transport, and silence. The most consistent accounts agree that Uday did not need to justify his actions. He simply pointed a finger at a young woman on the street, at a show, or in a room, and the machinery would start. Many of these kidnappings occurred in front of witnesses, at universities, official receptions, or sporting events, where the women were forcibly taken away by plainclothes escorts or soldiers in dress uniform. On some occasions, force was not even necessary. An invitation signed with his name was enough for families, out of fear or convenience, to send their daughters believing it was an acknowledgement or a job offer. Once inside Uday's private enclosures, there was no turning back. The women were locked in rooms without windows, guarded by guards who followed orders without question. If any resisted, they were abused, sedated, or intimidated with reprisals against their parents or siblings. In testimonies collected by Latif Yahia, Uday's double, it is precisely described how many arrived dressed for a party and ended up thrown out like garbage in the hallways, not knowing if they were going to be freed or silenced forever. The abuse sessions were not individual or sporadic acts, but rituals set up as spectacles to satisfy the desires of someone who only found pleasure in total humiliation. On many occasions, Uday summoned several of his collaborators to witness or even intervene in the acts, making it clear that no one should look away. The rooms were equipped with cameras that recorded everything that happened, and then those recordings were used to blackmail the victims or for his own entertainment. If any woman tried to escape, she was pursued by intelligence services and returned as a wounded trophy, with consequences even more cruel than the first time. Those who survived were released in deplorable physical and psychological conditions, and many of them preferred to remain silent out of shame, fear, or because they knew they had no one to turn to. The pattern was repeated with total impunity. No one was safe. Daughters of diplomats, students, singers, nurses, journalists, television actresses, athletes, even minor girls, all could become targets if they fit Uday's mood or whim. Their social origin, their faith or their political situation did not matter. If something in their appearance attracted him, the decision was made. On more than one occasion, Uday appeared at schools under the excuse of giving speeches or distributing scholarships, but in reality he went to choose new victims. He then organized dinners at his residences where the young women were forced to attend without knowing what would happen afterwards. Some disappeared that same night. Others spent days held captive, with no contact with the outside world, until their bodies were abandoned in remote places or thrown into canals without identification. The network of complicity was extensive. Army officers, Secret Service agents, assistants, drivers, cooks and doctors participated in silence, each one fulfilling specific functions. The doctors intervened when it was necessary to erase traces or perform unauthorized procedures. The drivers transported young women in vehicles without license plates. The cooks prepared banquets that disguised what was about to happen. There were even stylists in charge of putting on makeup and dressing the women according to the dictator's son's whims. Everyone knew that disobeying could cost them their lives. No one spoke. The fear was absolute, like an invisible gas that ran through the entire system. One of the most cruel episodes, recounted in The Devil's Double, began after a sporting ceremony. Uday set his eyes on a young woman from the audience and gave the order to take her to the palace. The girl tried to resist. Upon arrival, the situation became violent. She was subdued, locked up for hours and reduced to silence. In another room, between laughs and drinks, what was happening was witnessed without moving a finger. At dawn, her body was no longer there. It was eliminated as if it had never existed. No one was held accountable. Her family never received an explanation. And her story was just one among many, all with the same pattern: disappearance, silence, and horror. In some cases, the surviving women tried to speak. A young university student managed to escape from Uday's mansion and sought refuge in the embassy of a European country. There she recounted what she had suffered, but the regime reacted immediately. The embassy was pressured, her family was threatened, and she ended up being deported. She was never heard from again. Other women went to clerics or doctors for help, but they could not do anything. The regime's control was so overwhelming that even hospitals had instructions not to report injuries compatible with violence if the perpetrator could be linked to Uday. Fear paralyzed the entire society. Families knew that asking about a missing daughter could cost everyone their lives. One of the most disturbing aspects of this system was its regularity. It was not about occasional impulses or nights of excesses. It was a routine. Every week there were new women. The old ones were discarded. Some were held for days, others for months. Many were forced to sign documents in which they committed not to speak. Others were photographed in compromising situations and then threatened with divulging the images if they opened their mouths. The youngest, especially minors, were treated with a mixture of indulgence and brutality. Uday called them his princesses, while subjecting them to all kinds of punishments. Some of these girls did not even know where they were. They had been taken directly from schools or humble neighborhoods with no contact with the outside world. The use of drugs was common. Many were given pills dissolved in alcoholic beverages or juices to reduce their will. Others were forced to consume substances to facilitate their control. On more than one occasion, the parties began with music and forced laughter, but ended in scenes of screams, violence, and unresponsive bodies. Uday found pleasure in dominating even the last gesture of his victims. Submission was not enough for him. He needed to see the fear in their eyes. He wanted them to know that they could not do anything. That feeling of total control was his personal drug. He was addicted to that. The few who tried to stop this machinery failed. Some influential relatives requested meetings with Saddam to denounce his son's excesses. Instead of stopping Uday, the dictator scolded those who dared to question him. On other occasions, high-ranking army or Ba'ath Party commanders privately commented on their concern, but ended up being demoted, exiled, or murdered in accidents. Uday was untouchable. Even after committing crimes in broad daylight, such as that of his personal assistant Kamal Hana, he never faced real consequences. That impunity further fueled his sense of unlimited power, and the women, trapped in that cycle of terror, had no escape. As the regime slowly decomposed, Uday's practices became more cruel. During the 90s, after international sanctions and Iraq's growing isolation, disappearances increased. It is estimated that in Baghdad alone, dozens of teenagers were last seen leaving their schools in official cars. Some managed to escape and speak secretly with foreign journalists, but these reports were censored or ignored. The horror was so great that many preferred not to believe it. Even after the invasion, many details remained unclear due to lack of complete evidence. The lack of documents, the deliberate destruction of evidence, and the fear of the survivors made it difficult to reconstruct the true magnitude of the damage. What could be confirmed is that for more than a decade, Uday turned the country into his own hunting ground. He used women as disposable objects, imposed fear as a method of control, and extended his influence beyond the palaces. To universities, hospitals, hotels, clubs, embassies, television stations. The face of a woman who attracted him was enough to set in motion a chain that ended in abuse or death. No one could escape, and no one was willing to confront him. What for any other person would be a celebration or a social event, in Uday Hussein's universe it was transformed into an excuse to unleash planned violence. The parties in his mansions were precisely staged spectacles, where everything was designed to satisfy his whims and feed his need for absolute power. They were frequently held in luxurious rooms covered in dark curtains, surrounded by hidden cameras, with tables overflowing with imported food, expensive liquors, hired musicians, and dozens of young women selected for their appearance. Many of these girls were schoolgirls forced to attend, deceived with the promise of an academic award, a scholarship, or a job interview. Others were local actresses, television presenters, and even daughters of officials who did not dare to oppose him. The atmosphere at the beginning was tense but disguised as courtesy. The women arrived dressed in formal clothes that many times they had not chosen. Once inside, they were divided into groups according to Uday's taste, who watched from a corner, smoking, drinking, or playing with a weapon on the table. A gesture from him was enough for someone to be taken to a private room. Sometimes they would disappear for hours, other times they would never return. Those who returned did so staggering, with empty eyes, many without shoes or with their clothes disheveled. No one asked. The rest pretended not to see it. That was the only way to survive the night. Drugs and alcohol were an essential part of the mechanism. The drinks were adulterated with substances that weakened their will. Uday preferred defenseless, confused victims, incapable of reacting. He also used opioids and tranquilizers to prolong the effects. On some occasions, he would order the women to undress in front of everyone, while he made vulgar comments, humiliated them with forced games, or ridiculed them if they cried. If any dared to refuse, they would be hit with a stick, a slap, or a direct threat with a pistol. There were always weapons in sight. Some were decorative, others were not. He used them to control, intimidate, and, on more than one occasion, to shoot without warning. One of the most cruel cases narrated by his double, Latif Yahya, occurred during a party in which Uday felt offended by a young woman's contained laughter. He thought she was making fun of him. He ordered the music to stop, made the girl kneel in the middle of the room and whipped her with a leather belt, while the guests watched without intervening. Then, he ordered her to be served another drink as if nothing had happened. That mixture of violence and banality was constant. The punishments for looking badly, not obeying, laughing without permission, or simply not pleasing him were immediate and brutal. Some ended with women being thrown down the stairs, locked up without food for days, or directly eliminated without a trace. Uday's sadism had no limits. One day he could give a victim a luxury car, jewelry, or an apartment. The next, he could destroy her face for a gesture that he disliked. He handled fear like a surgical tool. He knew exactly how to keep the women and his surroundings in a state of permanent alert. The hidden cameras were his favorite resource. Everything was recorded. The images fed his private archive, accumulating hours of humiliation converted into personal trophies. No one wanted to appear in those recordings. They knew that if they disobeyed, those images could be sent to their parents, husbands, or even published on television. The creation of his secret harem was not a rhetorical exaggeration, but an organized structure. He had several residences destined exclusively for the accommodation of women that he would have to rotate according to his mood. Some were kept for weeks, others for years. They lived under surveillance, without phones, without access to the press, with guards trained to prevent any escape attempt. Sometimes they were rewarded with controlled outings to go shopping or for beauty treatments, but always escorted. It was a legalized sexual slavery under his regime. No one considered them victims. They were expected to obey and be silent. Among his victims were women who were once part of his intimate circle, lovers who became uncomfortable, friends who tried to set limits or who dared to confront him. All of them ended up badly. Some were found lifeless, with signs of extreme violence. Others simply disappeared without a trace. The story of the murder of his personal valet, Kamal Hana, was not an isolated event, but a reflection of what could happen when someone betrayed his trust or made the mistake of contradicting him. Violence was his way of establishing hierarchies. Those who participated in his parties knew it. They were there to follow orders, applaud, drink, be silent, and, if necessary, actively participate in the abuses. The closest circle to Uday, made up of bodyguards, secretaries, doctors, camera operators and drivers, fulfilled specific functions within this system. Some helped directly to select the women, others cleaned the rooms after each session, and a few were in charge of getting rid of the remains. Although they knew that what they were doing was criminal, none dared to report it. Everyone knew what awaited them if they spoke. Some who tried to flee were located in other countries and eliminated. Others simply disappeared from the public record. The terror was sustained not only by the punishment, but by the certainty that there was no way out. In a testimony after the fall of the regime, a former collaborator said that Uday had a coded list where he marked each victim with a score. There were colors to indicate if the girl was obedient, if she needed to be sedated more, if she could be reused, or if she had to be eliminated. That absolute dehumanization transformed the women into disposable merchandise. There was no empathy. There was no limit. Only the will of someone who believed he was above any law. And while this was happening within the walls of his mansions, a network of rumors was woven in the streets of Baghdad that no one dared to confirm. The families knew that there were things that could not be talked about. The journalists who tried to investigate were arrested. The women who survived did not know whom to trust. Even the foreign ambassadors avoided intervening for fear of provoking diplomatic incidents. Uday knew it. And that certainty that he could do anything without paying the consequences further fueled his cruelty. The attack that left Uday Hussein seriously wounded in 1996 did not stop him, as many expected. His body was permanently affected, with a visible limp and neurological sequelae, but his brutality only intensified. If before he enjoyed total physical control, he now turned his rage and frustration into even more ruthless forms of dominance. The abuse sessions became more erratic, the punishments more excessive, and the impulses more unpredictable. Although his public presence decreased, his private parties, his kidnappings, and his acts of terror continued with unconditional support from his circle of loyalists. Meanwhile, Iraq began to crumble under the weight of international sanctions imposed after the Gulf War. The population suffered from food shortages, electricity cuts, hospital collapse, and widespread impoverishment. But in the palaces of the Hussein clan, the extravagance remained intact. Uday, from his special chair, organized banquets, continued to document his abuses for his own consumption, and maintained his active network of complicity. State television avoided showing his physical deterioration, but rumors circulated that he could no longer maintain relationships without medical help, that he took even stronger drug cocktails, that his instability made him more dangerous than ever. Behind the walls of his residences, the terror remained invisible. The kidnapped teenagers did not disappear with the attack. Private meetings, presented as official receptions, hid a backdrop of submission and abuse. The use of chemical methods to nullify the will of those who fell into his networks became more sophisticated, and records accumulated in secret archives. Corpses appeared in rural areas, vacant lots or road margins, but no one dared to publicly link them to Uday. Families remained silent, judges obeyed, and doctors signed reports with false causes of death. The apparatus of fear functioned intact while the country sank. When in 2003 United States troops invaded Iraq, the regime's leadership panicked. Uday was one of the first to disappear. He changed residences several times, used doubles, and moved with escorts who almost worshipped him as a deity. He knew his name was among the most wanted, along with his father Saddam and his brother Qusay. Rumors about his hiding places multiplied, that he was in Tikrit, that he had disguised himself as a Shiite cleric, that he used women as human shields. While the country was bombed and the government crumbled, he moved through rural villas with reserves of cash, weapons and confidential materials with which he maintained control and the memory of his acts. The hunt ended on the 22nd of July of 2003, when US forces surrounded a house in Mosul where Uday, Hussein and the latter's son were hiding. For hours, the building was besieged. There was crossfire, negotiation attempts, detonations, and finally the final assault. The bodies of the three were found riddled with bullets. In Uday's case, his body was unrecognizable due to the impacts, but he was identified by biometric means. Images of his remains traveled the world. For many victims, it was not reparation, but it was a symbolic closure. The man who had imposed sexual terror as state routine had died. After the operation, troops found documents, computers, physical files, and dozens of videotapes. In some residences, they found hidden rooms meticulously prepared to control, record, and silence any trace of resistance, even decorated with disturbing details that reflected a decomposed mind. These were not improvised scenes, but installations prepared with clear intent to capture, subdue, record, and silence. Written records included lists with names, entry and exit times, administered doses, and even Uday's personal evaluations. Many of these materials were not revealed to the public, but some were leaked to the media or used in human rights reports. The emotional impact on Iraqi society was profound. Families who for years had feared speaking began to quietly recount what they had lived through. Some women in exile offered protected testimonies, others never dared to break the silence. The remains found in some residences allowed several disappeared victims to be identified, but many others were never officially recognized. The lack of forensic records, the destruction of files, and persistent fear hindered any formal investigation. For years, the subject was a taboo even within the new Iraqi government, fearful of reopening wounds that were too recent. The legacy Uday left after his death was a mix of shame, collective trauma, and contained rage. Women's organizations documented hundreds of cases that could be linked to his network of systematic subjugation for personal ends, but the real figures are probably much higher. It is estimated that thousands of young people, many of them minors, passed through his system of sexual slavery. Some died, others were left with irreversible physical damage, many were left with irreversible physical sequelae. And even though he was no longer there, the pain he left continued to be present in hospitals, broken families and generations marked by fear. Beyond the testimonies, the figure of Uday embodied a violence that was not limited to an individual. He represented the absolute use of power to humiliate, destroy, and subjugate without consequences. His death was not enough to heal. For years, many victims received neither psychological care nor official recognition. Some were stigmatized for having been Uday's women, as if they were guilty instead of survivors. The persistent silence in many areas of the country is not only a sign of fear, but also of the depth of the damage. Even today, in some sectors of Iraq, Uday's name is not mentioned. Women who passed through his networks live hiding their past, and families who lost daughters did not find justice. The state never implemented a structured reparation process. The archives found were not made public in their entirety, and new generations grow up with incomplete fragments of the horror that marked an entire country. Because what Uday Hussein did was not just the perversion of a sick man, it was the extreme symptom of a system that allowed power to be used to subjugate in the most intimate and cruel way, and silence as the norm. A system that, although it collapsed, left wounds that have not yet closed.